What began as a chaotic flurry of fighting seems to have slowed to a relative stalemate.
Ukrainians are putting up a good fight. The Ukrainian people believe that they're winning.
Russia is encountering resistance from Ukrainian troops. U.S. defense officials say Russian troops are largely stalled in their advances on all fronts.
Yes, Ukraine continues to fiercely defend itself against Russia's attack, which has been going on for about a month now. One of the most famous or infamous Ukrainian fighting units resisting the Russians is the far-right Azov Battalion, and that's what we're focusing on today. The Azov Battalion is made up of around 1,000 fighters, some of whom are believed to be linked to neo-Nazis and white supremacists. They claim to have had a lot of success fighting Russian forces, including killing a Russian general last week. But still, it's incredible to think that Ukraine's military formally contains such a unit, especially as the president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish. It's also incredible to see that Facebook has overturned its own ban on praising the battalion, and you can even buy Azov badges on Amazon. So are these supposed to be the good guys or bad guys now? The best video from the Ukrainian side of this conflict comes from the Azov Battalion. They understand the value of good PR and have been producing slick videos for years. They film themselves blowing up Russian tanks and generally tearing up the battlefield. Their biggest trophy so far is reportedly a Russian general, the fourth to be killed since Russia's attack began on February the 24th. Ukraine's military are proud to use their video as evidence of how well they're doing against a much larger enemy. Given the threat from the Russians, it's perhaps understandable Ukraine welcomes the Azov Battalion's help. But still, this is unique in Europe. No other country on the continent has a far-right unit like this. Its founder is Andrei Beletsky, a 42-year-old native Russian speaker who was born in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, near the border where most people speak Russian. It's Ukraine's second city and has now been badly damaged by Russian bombers. He identifies not as a neo-Nazi, but as a Ukrainian ultra-nationalist. In an interview in 2010, he said Ukraine's national purpose was to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen. He formed the Azov Battalion in early 2014, enlisting extreme football hooligans or ultras to his group, which was originally called Sect 82. It was a tumultuous time for Ukraine. There were huge protests against the pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, was pushed out of office, and then pro-Russian separatists rising up in the east. When the separatists in the Donbass region declared their independence from Ukraine in March 2014, it was the Azov Battalion which went to fight them. The Ukrainian military was unwilling to do so. The fighting centered around Mariupol, and they've been stationed there ever since. Ukraine's new pro-Western president at the time, Petro Poroshenko, praised them, calling them Ukraine's best warriors. But rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, reported credible allegations of torture and other egregious abuses by Azov and other volunteer units. The UN report also detailed how Azov soldiers had allegedly raped and tortured civilians. At that time, they enjoyed the backing of Ukraine's interior minister, who recognized that government forces were too weak to fight the separatists. These forces were funded by a number of Ukrainian oligarchs, some of whom were Jewish, but put aside their usual fears about the far right to ensure the sovereignty of Ukraine's heavily industrialized southeast. As the Azov Battalion grew, it changed its name to the Azov Regiment, and now it's known as the Azov Special Operations Detachment. It was officially incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard in late 2014. Today, the Azov Battalion, it's still most often referred to that way, is made up of around 1,000 fighters. Some experts believe its numbers may have grown since Russia attacked last month. In 2015, a battalion spokesman admitted that between 10 and 20% of its members were neo-Nazis or white supremacists. That may not be a lot of people in a country of over 40 million, but some Ukraine analysts say their power is also behind the scenes. Their ability to influence and threaten government officials. For example, when the current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, visited them on the front line in the east in 2019, he asked them to de-escalate the fighting. And Beletsky not only refused, but threatened to bring more fighters to the area. leaving the president exasperated.
Послушай, я президент страны, мне 42 года. Я ж не лох, я тебе пришел и сказал, оружие убери, а ты меня не переводи на акции. Про дочь. Мы с вами уже поговорили, вы потом... Я не поговорил с тобой, я хотел увидеть в глазах понимание. А увидел парня, который решил, что перед ним какой-то лопух стоит и переводишь меня на другую тему.
Judging by recent elections, Ukraine as a whole appears to have little time for the Azov Battalion's broader ideology. Beletsky was elected as an independent candidate to parliament in 2014 off the back of Azov's performance in Mariupol, but he failed to win another term in 2019. In fact, Azov's political party, the National Core, combined with all the other far-right parties in Ukraine, only won about 2% of the vote that year and didn't win a single seat in parliament. Ukrainians just don't have the same priorities as the Azov Battalion, even if they do celebrate their victories against the Russians. Journalists and experts in the West have been warning for years that the far right poses a threat to Ukraine's democracy. But when Vladimir Putin used it as a justification to attack, they all agreed that this was just a pretext for violence and that nothing justifies the killing and destruction now being visited on Ukraine. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, a couple of points you need to be aware of. The Azov Battalion has become a bit of a magnet for far-right types over the years globally. According to one think tank, about 17,000 people travelled to Ukraine to join Azov and other battalions since the conflict with pro-Russia separatists began in 2014. That's a 2019 report, so the numbers are possibly higher now. In the same year as that report came out, around 40 US congressmen and women attempted to have them declared a terrorist organisation. And also in 2019, Facebook banned the group for allegedly spreading hate speech, but it now allows users to praise the Azov Battalion in direct contravention of its own policy against hate groups. According to an article in The Intercept, Facebook will allow praise of the Azov Battalion when explicitly and exclusively praising their role in defending Ukraine or their role as part of Ukraine's National Guard. OK, let's bring in our guests now. In the top left there, we have Marko Gasic, an international affairs analyst who co-founded the London-based Serbian Information Centre during the Balkans War. Adrian Karatnycky, the co-director of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter in New York. Ivar Dale, he's from the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, a human rights watchdog, and he also lived in Kiev until last year and has also visited the Donbass region. And finally, Adrien Nonjon is an academic whose research focuses on the far right in Ukraine. And Marko Gasic, I want to start with you, particularly as amongst this panel, you're probably the only one who really believes that the Azov Brigade or Battalion and the far right in general in Ukraine pose a very big threat to Ukraine's democracy and to relations with Russia. Just explain why.
Essentially, the extreme right, the neo-Nazis of Ukraine, represented by the Azov and other battalions like the Adar battalion as well, are a problem. Even though they're disproportionately quite small, they're proportionately quite a small proportion of the Ukrainian population, but they've got disproportionate share of power and influence over both the army and the political structures. They were the ones, if you remember, who converted at the US behest, who converted the Maidan demonstrations from a peaceful protest to one of extreme violence. One of their own leaders, Andrei Belitsky, said of that event, if we hadn't been involved, it would have resembled a gay parade, was the way he put it on being interviewed. Now, moving on from there, once they'd got the ball rolling and the violence rolling and burnt 42 people to death in Odessa and taken the credit for that, another of their leaders, Dmitry Yarosh, called it a historic day for Ukraine, they naturally created a complete, utter rupture with the west, with the east of Ukraine, where the ethnic Russians who voted for the president that they deposed, the democratically elected president that they deposed by violence at Maidan. And having created that rupture and having got the east of Ukraine and the Donbass to declare themselves independent of anything that was going on in Kiev, they then formed their Azov Battalion to actually fight those ethnic Russians, which they've been doing ever since. And they don't, as neo-Nazis, they don't do negotiation. They don't do peace. And they've threatened the successive president of Ukraine with death including Zelensky, on the threatened with hanging in the main street of Kiev if he actually would implement the Minsk Accords, which were agreed by Russia, Germany, France, and the others. So you have basically a group of people who dominate, as it were, political discourse at the highest level, who are represented in the army but not answerable to the army, whose leaders have been declared advisor, commander-in-chief of the army, and who have another branch who enforce discipline on the streets of Ukraine through beating and attacking, whipping ordinary Ukrainians who may not share their views. They then film these things on video and they put them out on Twitter to scare other people into submission. So yes, they're small, but they're very significant. I should say there's a continuity between them and the Nazis of the Second World War, because Ukraine, unlike Germany, properly denazified and of ideology. Anything they now say about throwing back the Nazi label is just a branding exercise designed to allow themselves to take as much power as they possibly can. There can be no peace in Ukraine without denazification of Ukraine, and that's why.
Adrien Nonjon, you've been studying Ukraine's far right for some time now. Do you recognize what Marko Gasic is saying as fact or fiction?
Well, actually, I mean, I don't agree at all. I mean, first of all, of course, the far right was on the Maidan, but it didn't break the violence itself. It's because of Viktor Yanukovych repressed the manifestations. Also, I would say that, of course, some elements integrated the National Guard, but it was actually the aim of the first Minsk protocol signed in summer 2014. It was for them to, in a term of de-escalation of the war, to maintain these so-called war dogs and paramilitary groups under the control. So, and nowadays, I mean, all of them, included the Azov regiment, are absolutely depoliticized. And this so-called neo-Nazi core is absolutely marginalized in the flow of new volunteers and recruits.
Adrian Karatnycky, you're a Ukrainian American. You're also Jewish. As far as I understand, that you believe that the sort of remarks that Marko Gasic have made are basically just repeating Putin's propaganda. Why would you think that when they have such a terrible reputation over the last few years leading up to the attack? You know, we've been warned by many, many journalists in the West that they pose a threat to Ukraine's democracy. We've heard from the United Nations. We've heard from the human rights organizations. They've been carrying out atrocities in the East. Why would you think now that those points are just Putin propaganda?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to state for the record that Azov is a very marginal group. It represents at this point about 900 fighters, probably degraded by the combat in Mariupol, out of 100,000 in the National Guard, so less than 1%, and less than 0.5% from the 250,000 standing armed forces. There are no Azov people in the leadership of the country. The defense minister is Jewish. The commander-in-chief president is Jewish. The previous government had a Jewish prime minister. And the gentleman is very kindly concerned about the death of 41 people, while Vladimir Putin has just buried 15,000 Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East. His attacks are the real form of Nazism. Yes, Aidar and Azov were filled with disagreeable people. Over time, their units were partially reformed. There is still some ideological, I wouldn't call them neo-Nazis, because mainly most Ukrainians are anti-Nazi. Even the alleged leader of the Nazis, Mr. Bandera, the leader of the Second World War, spent 3.5 years in a concentration camp because what he was interested in was the independence of his country above all. He too was, in my view, a disreputable person who believed in objectionable ideas.
Yes.
But they are not.
May I just pick up on that point? You're talking about Stepan Bandera. He was the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which, from what I understand, he persecuted Jews in Ukraine during the Second World War, and there are statues to him in numerous parts of the country. Is that not the case?
Persecute Jews in Ukraine. He was in a concentration camp in Ukraine, arrested just weeks after the Nazis put out an order to eliminate the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Yes, he was an anti-Semite, and yes, he bears moral responsibility, as do other anti-Semites, for the atmosphere that emerged in Europe in the 1930s, but he was not guilty of the physical extermination that was done by the Nazis, and who were the partners of the Soviet Union for the first 2 years.
I want to give Marko Gasic the opportunity to reply, and then we're going to go to Ivar Dale. Marko.
Stepan Bandera's forces killed 15,000 Poles in one village in a single day in a massacre that the SS, the Nazis, were themselves shocked by. You cannot try and whitewash Stepan Bandera and his forces, all that he represents, because today's Ukrainian nationalists are fully aware of what Bandera's forces did with him along or in his name. In both instances, you cannot whitewash that loyalty. Genocidal killer of Poles and Jews.
Okay, Marko, I would like to just skip.
And one other thing. You refer to deaths. The Donbas region, which was targeted by the Azov Battalion, has had 13,000 civilian deaths since the Azov Battalion got going, before the Russians intervened to stop it.
Marko, just to bring it up to date, now we've alluded to what happened in the Second World War, but to bring it up to date, Adrian was saying that the view that the Azov Battalion is full of white supremacists and Nazis is an outdated one, and that they have changed over the years, and they have, as he said, less than 1% of the National Guard. So why are we dwelling on that at all?
Why would you change if you have these views and suddenly your views are being tested in battle? You are going to be sticking to those views, extolling those views, and you are going to be more loyal to those views than ever. But when a wealthy American foreigner comes along and starts talking to you, you'll of course say something nice about that, something moderate sounding to get his support. But I should say that this is an embarrassment for the USA, this link to the neo-Nazis whom they supported at Maidan and since. And therefore, I'm not surprised that US people from the Atlantic Council, which represents NATO by another name, are trying to whitewash today's Azov Battalion, because it's the United States reputation which is at issue here as well. And in support for such extreme elements.
Adrian's response, please, if I may. Adrian's response.
Let me say briefly, number one, the Azov Brigade is a disreputable group. The ideology of Biletsky and his group, let's have no doubts about it. But they don't represent any serious threat to the power structure of Ukraine. And the amount of devastation against Russian speakers brought upon by this genocidal attack by President Putin. And I'd like to hear you say something about that, sir, since you are so concerned about the deaths in the Donbass. It's the same people that are being pummeled to death in Mariupol. The people of Mariupol are no different than the people in Donetsk. Why did the 3/4 of Ukrainians flee Donetsk into Ukraine, not into Russia? They knew that they would be safe there. They knew that they would be treated as democratic, free people. The problem is that a criminal regime has been established in the Donbass. The problem is that a genocidal policy is being pursued by the Nazis in the Kremlin. And you're talking about 41 people who died in a
Marko, if we may allow Marko to come in for a second.
1 million people have fled the Donetsk Republic, if I may. 1 million people have fled the Donetsk Republic to go to Russia. They're refugees. The only reason that people are fighting in Mariupol now and in other cities like Kharkiv is because the Azov Battalion have forced the situation to be either occupation or devastation. And the Azov Battalion want the choice to be devastation. The reason why there's battling in Mariupol now is because the Azov Battalion not allowing civilians to leave.
I mean, what kind of...
Excuse me, we cannot hear either of you because you're talking over each other. And at this point, I would like to bring in Ivar Dale, if I may. Ivar Dale, you work for a human rights group, advocacy group. You lived in Kiev for just over a year or so. You visited the Donbass region and you went to Mariupol. As someone who represents a human rights group, can you tell us who is causing the most egregious abuses, if you like, of human rights in that region?
Well, that changes over time. Until recently, the worst human rights violations were the responsibility of the separatist leaders in the so-called People's Republic of Donetsk and the People's Republic of Luhansk. Right now, it's the Russian army under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, who, as one of the other guests here rightly said, is completely destroying cities, killing people by the thousands. And I agree, we shouldn't be naive about right-wing groups. I don't like right-wingers more than I like far left-wingers. And but you know, we have neo-Nazis in Norway, we have neo-Nazis in Russia. They are marginal groups.
Well, I mean, you'll be aware, Ivar,
in Ukraine.
Ivar, you'll be aware that after 2014, Human Rights Watch produced a report saying that the Azov Battalion and other far-right types, there was evidence that they had tortured people, raped people. The UN High Commission on Human Rights said something very similar.
Yes, there have been reports from the UN on the ground that found violations by both sides. This has become slightly different over the years, and the most recent report shows that the systematic use of torture, extrajudicial killings, and of course all the types of repression that you see in Russia normally is evident mostly in these separatist controlled areas where there is you know, the grounds for impunity, whereas Ukraine, the government controlled parts of Ukraine, have taken leaps towards institution building and towards normalizing the society after the revolution of 2014.
Adrien Nonjon, I need to ask you, as an expert in the extreme right here, in the far right in Ukraine, why is it, do you think, that since 2014, when the Azov Battalion formed, Western news outlets have been producing copious amounts of articles warning that the far right, and the Azov Battalion in particular, posed a threat to Ukraine's democracy? And now we're expected to believe they're actually to be minimalized and you know, they're nothing to worry about.
Well, because I think since is integration to National Guard, and even if the fact that they created their own movement, I mean the far right in terms of weight in political area is very minimal. They don't represent any threat. Ukrainians are enough mature. They love democracy. It's like it's a normal country, and they understand that they are not going to give power to these such groups. I mean the far right is very minimal, and people in Ukraine are not naive at all about that.
Marko Gasic, you've made the point that don't look at the numbers. Look at what's happening behind the scenes. They have power that we cannot see. What evidence do you have for that?
Well, one particular one, which sums it all up and really negates what the previous speaker has just said, is that you have footage of Vladimir Zelensky turning up to the Azov Battalion in 2019, telling them that he decided to go for peace and asking them to disarm. Basically, he was going to respect the Minsk Accords, which gave special status to Donbass. And you see on the footage the Azov Battalion telling him in no uncertain terms to go away. And they didn't put it quite like that. If the president of Ukraine has got no power to call off junkyard dogs of the Azov Battalion, then what chance does the rest of Ukrainian society have?
Adrian Karatnycky, there is footage of that. We see an exasperated Zelensky saying, you know, I'm 41 years old, I'm not a loser, I'm telling you to disarm. And he went away somewhat with his tail between his legs.
The fact is that the Ukrainian people, by a vast majority, are opposed to making concessions to Russia as a result of Russian aggression, Russian territorial occupation of Ukraine's Crimea, and Russian support and in the takeover of large swaths of their territory. It wasn't the Azov Battalion that pushed Zelensky into a corner on capitulating through the Minsk Accords. It was Ukrainian society, public opinion, that today by 90% is opposed to any concessions to people that they regard quite rightly as terrorists and agents of an aggressive state that has been waging a war for 8 years against Ukraine. Look, it's true that small battalions can have a disruptive power. Beletsky is not a Democrat, but I don't think he is no longer a threat because Ukrainian society is, you know, first of all, it voted for 73% for Zelensky. Secondly, it voted for a guy they knew was a Jewish man. They do not accept the racist ideas that Beletsky and his ilk put forward.
Just a quick last answer from Marko Gasic. The fact is, in the 2019 election, we saw that Ukrainian society pretty much rejected the far right. They got less than 2% of the vote, and they didn't get any seats in parliament. So the idea of denazifying Ukraine on that basis seems ludicrous.
If you remember, the Bolshevik in the Imperial Russia were a very small group of people who managed to take over the reins of the entire country and kill millions as a result. So let's not say that a small group can't have power and influence if it's determined. And the Azov Battalion and the neo-Nazis with them are very determined. And so far, they've been very successful at controlling Ukrainian society in ways which you can verify. They're proud of what they do with their talks
Marko Gasic.
Stepan Bandera and their discipline over, as I say, politicians like Zelensky and Poroshenko to stop them taking the peace option.
Marko Gasic, thank you so much. We have run out of time. Adrian Karatnycky, Ivar Dale and Adrien Nonjon, thank you all very much for your contributions to The Nexus today, and thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in TRT World and Nexus and it will come up for you. Till next week then, goodbye.